it's not what the influencers are doing. It's different. As you say, it's a more subtle. It's still cold, but it's a more subtle exposure. I do find myself talking to athletes saying, "You just need to go to bed a bit earlier." Really common. Just go to bed a bit earlier. How do we actually manage it, and what are some of the interventions that might reduce mental fatigue?
Hi there, and welcome to the Supporting Champions podcast. Now, my name is Dr. Steve Ingham, performance scientist by trade and training. And in these discussions with performance experts, practitioners and performers, I explore how we deliver performance, how we support others to perform, and the underpinning knowledge and concepts at play. I really hope you enjoy the conversations from today's episode or from the back catalogue. And if you do, it'd be great if you can take a chance to like and subscribe to the channel, or for the audio, take a moment to leave a review. It really helps the show. Right, let's get into the discussion.
Well, folks, welcome to the Sporting Champions podcast. Today, I am excited to be joined by Shona Halson, professor at Australian Catholic University. But Shona has played a real pivotal role in Australia's high-performance sports system, serving as head of recovery at the Australian Institute of Sport, serving, as it were, through numerous Olympic cycles. But applying her expertise not just to athletes, she's published over 160 peer-reviewed articles, and in so doing, being recognised as one of ESSA's key female leaders in exercise and sports science. Shona, how are you?
Good. Thank you, Steve. Thanks for the introduction and the invitation to be on the podcast.
Wonderful. Hey, look, can you give me a bit of a background? See, I don't know this, but I mean, how did you get into studying and working in sports science?
Cool. Yeah, so I was always, obviously, like most of us, interested in sport, interested in athletes, and obviously not good enough to be one myself. So I ended up interested in sports science.
What were you trying to be? Go on. We've all got a failed athlete story.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was a failed sprinter. 100 metres was too far. 60 metres was about right. So
we've got a connection there. 100.
No, both bad at 100 metres.
Both bad at 100 metres. I was slightly better at 200. I probably should have been at 400. But go on, keep going. Sorry.
There you go. No, running was my thing. I played a bit of tennis, but yes, obviously not to the standard required. But so yeah, always interested in sport. Did exercise science undergraduate degree, and then actually was really interested in fatigue. So went on to do a PhD in Birmingham, actually, a number of years ago. And then, started at the AIS when they had a job advertised in fatigue and recovery. And I was like, well, I'm really interested in fatigue. I don't know anything about recovery. But turned out the job was mostly recovery. So it was a pretty quick learning curve after starting at the Institute in about 2002.
And so that was that a hands-on physiologist role, working directly with a sport, but that had big recovery demands. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, it was a bit of an interesting one because most of the physiologists were exactly what, as you were mentioned, they would work specifically with one or two sports and be sort of hands-on. So given that my role as recovery was really sort of to work across multiple sports, we grew recovery from just me to obviously more staff and PhD students, and then we could, I guess, specialise with certain sports a little bit more than others. But so yeah, it was hands-on in terms of education and monitoring. There was a large research component, trying to increase the sort of evidence base around recovery because there certainly wasn't a lot. So yeah, it was really a combination of sort of servicing and education with the athletes, and then some research as well.
And so that had a specific remit around recovery, but across different sports.
Yeah, so it was really interesting. When I first started, the main task that I had was to sort of benchmark recovery and travel the world and see, what other countries were doing and where did we sit, as Australia in comparison to other countries, and then really to put some evidence base around it. But interestingly, at the same time as starting to do the research, we had some significant government money to build a recovery centre. So it was kind of this idea of we're trying to build something for recovery at the same time just starting to kind of increase our knowledge and research around it. So it was a bit of a sort of cart before the horse, but you know what it's like when you get money, you have to spend it. So there was a little bit of work there around trying to identify what we should put in a recovery centre.
So where did you start in terms of equipment list? You just let's just get some sofas, get everyone to sit
Yeah.
down a bit. Let's get the fundamentals in first.
It was pretty wild. Because it's interesting because exactly as you say, to me, fundamentals are like sleep and nutrition, and obviously had a nutrition department led by Louise Burke, so it's about as good as you can get. We had on-site facilities for sleep, as athlete residences, and so it really sort of came down to actual strategies that you could put in there. And we did have some water immersion strategies previously, so we sort of started with refining those and making those better, and then I really wanted to make sure we had space so that if in 10 years' time something fantastic came up, we could integrate that. But yeah, it was really just kind of do your best with sort of what we know at the time and what we found that athletes liked and that they sort of responded positively to, because although, I just started, it wasn't like the first time athletes had been doing recovery, right? So there was lots of athletes out there doing things already. So sort of understanding what they were doing and what they liked and then trying to integrate it.
And so can I take from that like you said, the cart led the horse, in the sense that somebody somewhere said, look, let's build a facility. And they thought, well, we need someone to staff it. And then you take that role on. And then you've then got to kind of create it from, rather than we need to invest and develop recovery, we need to work on this area because it's important. Because I mean, this probably hints to actually often how you work with athletes, where you get them hooked on a shiny thing and actually then you end up selling them on some of the fundamentals. Was that the way around it worked in Australia then?
Yeah, and it was really just, I think the, large funding for the whole site was being redeveloped. So, we got the brand new 50-metre swimming pool. There was lots of things happening at the same time. So it was really just, look, here's an opportunity. I'm not going to say no to a few $1 million to build something, but if obviously in an ideal world, the government funding would have come at a slightly later time. But I look back now and I look at the centre and I still think, yeah, I'll probably make some little refinements, but I think overall, I'm fairly happy with the sorts of strategies and things that we included in there.
Interesting. And like you say, athletes have always done recovery. I mean, whether they liked it or not, whether it was an intentional thing, whether it was something they gave a label to. It'd be good to get your sense on the rise of the focus on recovery. If I could throw my sort of 10 cents in to start off with, I get a sense sort of going from certainly the British system, where we had outstanding athletes that were going to win, and they didn't really need to invest in some extra mile. They just did their great training. They had their genes sent from heaven, and they're like, well, what's all that stuff? I don't need to worry about that. But perhaps the next tier down, who want to get more return from their training, it started to become a focus. That was where we put the attention. For you to cope with that training program, you're going to have to enhance your recovery. And it gave sort of permission for people to invest in things where you didn't need talent. You didn't need genetics. You didn't need that. What's your sense of how this has evolved over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is interesting when I think back about, some of the most, amazing athletes, truly elite athletes that I've worked with over time. And I think there certainly are some that were going to be good anyway, right? Didn't matter.
Yeah.
They could have probably been coached by anyone almost. Like, they were going to be good. And then I think there's some that probably, were successful for a combination of just doing everything right. Like they took care of their recovery and their sleep and their nutrition and their physio. Like they just ticked all those boxes. But I do agree that probably looking at some of the lower level athletes that maybe, or some of the slightly less talented, that, maybe integrating some of these areas and doing things really properly from a sports science perspective might be able to take them to that next step. But I always do wonder, like, some of these amazingly talented athletes that don't seem to do anything, I wonder what if they did do something? What if they did actually go the next level? They didn't need to, but I wonder what would happen if they did.
The Usain Bolt chicken nugget algorithm is that really you can win on chicken nuggets and
nuggets.
flappy vest and shorts.
Yeah, can be done. Just genetically super gifted.
doesn't prove the number of times I said it. It doesn't prove that chicken nuggets make you run
No,
fast.
no, don't get that idea, athletes.
And do you have a pitch for those athletes who maybe are not interested and they just want to focus on good training and
Mhm.
not necessarily get fussy or give too much attention to the other stuff? Do you have a pitch to athletes and coaches to say it's worth your time and investment to work on this area?
Yeah, again, another really good question because sometimes I wonder. Just recently met with a really talented athlete who didn't do a lot of recovery, and I kind of felt like for him maybe it might not mess things up, but
Yeah.
we're getting close to, we're obviously getting, well, we're really close now to Paris. Like, it certainly wasn't the time for me to start pitching for him to, to start doing more things in his program that he wasn't doing. And maybe he was, he doesn't need all that extra recovery and the extra time that he's got in his day. He's spending relaxing or doing other fun things that he likes. So, but then I do think there are athletes where I would have the pitch, and I think that, it's a it's an interesting conversation to have, and I think obviously, the more you know the athlete, the more which way you have to try and sell your pitch. When you understand what they're trying to get out of it, then it can potentially help you direct where your selling point. But sometimes it's just direct. When I do have those athletes that say, "I'm not sure I need it, and I'm doing pretty well," like, well, have you tried it? Have you tried it in the past and you didn't like it? That's the case, we're all good. If you've never really tried it, I could just give it a go for a while. I'm not saying this is something you need to do for the rest of your life, but maybe maybe have a try and see if it results in improvements. Because
Mm,
if you haven't tried it, you never know. But I think there's that balance between overcomplicating, adding extra things to already really high level people,
mm,
and trying to those ones that could do with a little bit extra.
mm. It's interesting, isn't it? I remember working with a footballer, and he said, "I am excellent at doing nothing," and yeah, that's a world-class skill. I get back from
Yeah.
training and I do nothing. So that's really good. But then I think of Lucy Gossage, multiple Ironman winner, and when she was talking about sort of going full time as an athlete, I mean, she's wired. She's always up doing charity events. She's an oncology doctor. She's got energy. She said, I really struggled. The sort of prescription was to sit and watch Netflix or read and not do a lot, but I really struggled because I just wanted to do things. And that's just interesting. It's just that passive element of when you're not training, you should be resting, whether it is
Resting.
you're labeling it active or just doing nothing as the fundamental to remove no more stress.
Yeah. And I think, a couple of things come to mind when you say that. I think one is the idea of constantly being told what to do. Your day
Right.
is structured right to within an inch of your life. Often when you're an athlete, you got to be here at this time and do this. And often I think with recovery, it's important to have that element of choice. Like, I would hate it if someone was telling me, for my full waking hours, and even now when you're asleep, you're almost being, prescribed, sleep as well. So I think there's that, the idea of having an element of choice, which I think is really nice. And then just understanding the differences between athletes, like as you talked about there, there's, two different beings, right? And we noticed that when we first started monitoring athletes' sleep and we were asking them to wear activity monitors during the day, you could clearly see some were out playing golf or taking their kids shopping, and there were others that were just on the couch. And I don't think there was a right or wrong. It was just the way that each of those individuals was choosing to spend their free time, and what gives you time away from sport. Is that, going shopping with your kids, or is that, absolutely doing nothing? So again, I really think with the athletes, I think early on in my career I was very much prescriptive, and obviously to an extent, but I think now I listen to the athletes a lot more. Always listen to them and ask their opinion. What
Yeah.
works for you, and how does this work fit into your life? Because the athlete's voice is so important, especially the really experienced and successful ones.
Yeah, that's interesting. Just the very sense of what do you enjoy, what relaxes you, what recovers you. You mentioned the
Yeah,
shopping word there. I don't find shopping relaxing. I find
no,
it equivalent to what I would imagine is frontline warfare. But it's that's stressful for me. But for
yes,
others, it's a
yes,
serene sort of waft through a shopping centre, which probably enhances their recovery hormonal ratio, but not me. But choosing
not
that
Mhm.
that sense of what is specific. Yeah, it does remind me of. I remember going on when I was with the rowing team. This was ages ago now. But we were up at altitude in Austria pre-Olympics. Actually, no, it wouldn't have been Olympic year. I don't think we would have done it Olympic year. Hard training program. Second, third week, and everyone was just head down, and I was taking all their baseline recovery stats, and the coach said, "Look, let's have a day off." Everyone's really battered, and everyone said, "Let's go and do something fun." And we all went off to a water slide park, and we had a right laugh. It was a great couple of hours. But they pushed it. They were all just Olympic level sliding,
competitive.
and the next day, all their recovery marks were all terrible. And they're like, "Hang on a minute, water sliding's harder than Olympic rowing training." And I said, "Well, I think it's probably the novelty of it and the intensity of it. But
yes.
And now you're going to find the next week even harder because you didn't rest."
Yeah, no, that's very true. And I think, each athlete is going to respond differently to that. But you're exactly right. As soon as you put a group of athletes together, it's potentially competitive, right? So I'm trying to find those activities for off days that might not involve so much of a competition environment.
Yeah, playing Scrabble was really intense. Do you have a hierarchy? Do you have a sense of the things that are going to give you the biggest return on investment, followed by smaller returns, regardless of whether they are popular or they're the latest thing, or there's a wave of interest from influencers using it, or there's a product attached to it? Have you got a sense of get the basics right, or at least understand the return on investment from different levels?
I'll talk about whenever I'm, talking to athletes or talking about recovery, I give them my version of what I think that sort of prioritization is. And I always say that, sleep and mental recovery. So just as we were talking about, brain downtime, if you want to call it that, sleep and mental recovery as the foundation. And I know we don't have quite as much science on that as we do against, say, nutrition, but I think of what are we spending the majority of our 24 hours doing? And that's obviously sleep and hopefully some sort of downtime. So I always think of the bottom of the pyramid that the most important thing is to nail and get your sleep and your mental recovery right. And then I have nutrition above that. And look, you could probably put those together. But I again, just looking at the amount of time you spend doing it, we obviously spend more time sleeping and resting than we do eating. But obviously fully recognising the decades of research that's been done on the importance of nutrition for recovery. And then I've kind of got sort of three that I group kind of together, but based on the level of research. And I have water immersion slightly further down the bottom of the pyramid. So again, just based on the amounts of research that we have in that space being slightly more important, soft tissue massage therapy, and then compression, both compression garments and some of the intermittent pneumatic type pressure devices. And then at the top I just have fads or things that have almost no evidence. And when I often use that to sort of explain to athletes, because I'm sure well enough that I'm not telling you anything you didn't know, that the trend is for people to go to the top of the pyramid and the shiny thing that goes bang that someone's using on Instagram, rather than, okay, let's spend the time to make our sleep and nutrition as good as we can. So in the middle of the pyramid's a little bit, we could argue either way on some of those things, but I think they're less of a priority than sleep and nutrition, but more of a priority than some of these other strategies that we don't really know what they're doing and probably don't work.
And then how's that tend to get received? What's the entry point for people to inquire or get advice for you? Do people come in at the bottom of the pyramid mostly, or for your other colleagues that are advising similarly, or do they start at the top?
I would say they probably start somewhere around the top to middle, because when people think about recovery, unfortunately, they don't always think sleep and they don't always think nutrition. They tend to think gadgets or ice baths. So probably somewhere up the top to middle. And so, for me, when I'm trying to give these messages, it's really around, you can do a 10-minute ice bath, and I'm sure there's times where that is absolutely the right thing to do and it's effective. But then let's not think that you've completely recovered if you haven't gotten yourself a reasonable night's sleep.
Mm. Okay, so I mean, would it be okay if we could sort of go through some of those and just sort of get your top level thoughts on each area?
Absolutely.
And maybe if we sort of take out nutrition, because maybe sort of cover that with somebody else there. But I mean, your research is formidable in the area of sleep now. Do you have a sense of it being something you need to individualize sleep support and interventions, or are there's some generic principles that everybody can take away that you think, look, if it's not like training intervals that you have to design for a certain event. Here's some generic principles that apply to the species of human.
Yeah. I think there are definitely some generic principles, and there are things that you can guide people to do. Probably more often than not, it's, yes, here are the principles and things that we should try to focus on. But importantly, there's a lot of things that we shouldn't be doing, and they're probably the things that get in the way most. So if you think about caffeine and alcohol and social media and stress and those kinds of things. So sometimes it's not about do this, it's about avoid or manage these other things. But having said that, even though things that, say, you and I could be chatting to an athlete and things that we would think are absolute no-brainers, there's still significant occasions where I'll be sitting down and talking to an athlete and they'll not understand that 300 milligrams of caffeine for a 4 p.m. training session is probably going to have an influence on their sleep. So I do think there's some generic things, and I love the best thing that I like doing in terms of working with athletes is to sit down and talk sleep and try to put the puzzle together. They'll tell me they're a bad sleeper and we'll ask all the questions and try to work it out. For me, that's the most fun thing I can do in terms of working with athletes. And so often you've got the general guidelines and the generic information, but sometimes for some individuals, you've really got to dig, because I think, we've always slept our whole lives, right, since we were born. And so people have this preconceived notion of what's normal or normal for them, and that may actually be completely not normal. And I always say to coaches, I say, we can measure DEXAs and skin folds, and we measure everything in training. You can GPS and heart rate, you name it. We've got these measures now, but what we don't know is what they're doing for a third of the day. So understanding that aspect and monitoring in particular can give you some really useful information. But I think a combination of some generic stuff, and then if they've got a problem, let's dig down and try to find out what it is.
And what's your thought, if you're working with an athlete, do you tend to, on the balance of precision and validity through to immediacy, and maybe the algorithm's not quite as good, from sort of polysomnography, sleep labs stuff, which really disrupts sleep from my experience, through to actigraphy, where you might need to give that person a unit for a couple of weeks to get baseline measures, but the resolution of being able to give them feedback is slower versus an Oura Ring or a work that they're all right, they're good, but they're uploaded instantly to an app. Where's your sense of, if you're working with an athlete who's pushing the levels of performance, where do you position that in terms of the balance between immediacy versus quality of information?
Quality, yeah. I'd start with polysomnography and say, if I suspected a medical sleep disorder, absolutely a night in a sleep lab. Apart from that, I wouldn't touch it. We do it for research purposes to look at interventions, but in athletes, unless you suspect a medical sleep disorder, and trying to get athletes into a lab anyway is really tricky. Actigraphy was what we'd always done, and the thing I don't like about it is how labour intensive it is for us, right? And the thing I do like about it, though, is the athlete gets no feedback until they get a report from us and we sit down and talk to them.
Right. Okay. Am I assuming then you want to get in between them looking at the data on an app and seeing a red bar saying this part of your sleep is rubbish, and then being depressed by it?
Yes, that's what I do like about actigraphy. Having said that, I think if you can before an athlete puts on an Oura Ring or a Whoop, if you can talk to them, tell them what to look at in those variables and why, and to take certain things with a grain of salt, then I think they can be actually really useful. Because, of course, the other things you get in that, all the physiological data, right, so that you don't get with an activity monitor typically. So you get heart rate variability both overnight. You get sleeping temperature, which, I mean, we're doing some research now and we can see really clearly in naturally menstruating women where ovulation occurs or doesn't occur, right? So the temperature metrics. So we're getting some interesting stuff in addition to what you would simply get with sleep with activity monitors, and you get it real time, which, for example, I was sitting down talking to some of our key athletes before they left for Paris, just talking through their recovery and sleep strategies. And the ones that had Oura or Whoop data, it was fantastic to be able to talk them through things. Otherwise, you're really relying on them saying, I think I'm a bad sleeper, but having that data and saying, look, treat yourself as an individual. Let's not compare yourself to anyone else. Just look at your changes over time, and you can really use that data to give really good insights. So it was always very strictly activity monitoring. I still like them. We still use them in research because I really trust them. But I think now for athletes, provided you set it up right and they're not getting obsessed with the numbers, and they understand what they're looking at. Like the number of athletes say to me, HRV, should it be high or low? Like they just don't understand, right? So, but if you can help them understand, I really like the wearables, the ease of use, and athletes are way more likely to wear an Oura Ring or a Whoop for long periods of time than an activity monitor.
Yeah. Okay. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because sometimes we can get fussy about trying to calibrate machines to a level of precision that is not warranted when it comes to the vagueness or the uncertainty of the prescription. Whether your lactate is 0.2 or 0.02 lower, doesn't matter. You've got to interpret it. What when you're working with athletes, is this something you end up, and assuming you don't just go into sort of a similar intervention just because you're lazy, because you will want to try and make an intervention impactful. Do you find, though, that there are some bits of advice that you roll out on numerous occasions? What are the most common bits of advice that you provide?
Yes. Yeah, that's a great question because you do see patterns. I think one of the things that we do see is, and this is the same in non-athletes as well, is for most of us, we have a fixed wake time, right? We have to have an alarm, or we have to be somewhere at a certain time. What we have control over is more than the wake time is our bedtime. And so I do find myself talking to athletes saying, you just need to go to bed a bit earlier. Really common, just go to bed a bit earlier. Also very common around caffeine use and trying to optimize that. So what's the right amount to help them perform? But, well, it's not even to help them perform. It's the amount of caffeine now I'm seeing being consumed for training sessions in the afternoon. It's much higher than I'd thought it was. So this letting them know, you have caffeine here at this time, it's going to influence your sleep. So trying to talk to them about sleep in terms of caffeine intake, relatively or slightly earlier bedtimes is a really common thing. Being careful with their hydration so that they're not overhydrating before bed and spending time going to the bathroom. And then probably the last one is identifying what they can do pre-sleep that's going to help them fall asleep. So for some people, if someone told me to meditate, I'd just laugh because it's not going to work. It's not the way my brain operates. I wouldn't do it. But if someone says read a book or listen to a podcast until you get sleepy, I'd probably do that because that's more of a distraction technique. So quite often I sit and I talk to the athletes and try to identify if they're struggling to fall asleep, what sorts of things they could do. And then the last one I should say is napping. We do see some athletes having really long naps during the day. And then, of course, that results in them sleeping poorly. And then that results in them having to have a nap during the day. So trying to optimize the nap timing during the day so it doesn't interfere with their nighttime sleep.
Interesting. And that idea about finding the thing that helps you get sleepy, rather than, okay, go to bed earlier, which is a good. This might extend the amount of sleep that somebody's getting, but also coaching that in a way that is do something until you get sleepy, that you're feeling that sleep pressure rise, rather than thinking, I've got to go and sleep now. It's 10:20 and it's 20 minutes past what I said I was going to do.
Yes. Couldn't agree more. And that's something that, again, we have to have this balance with when you're talking to athletes, because you want them to think that and understand that sleep is important and they need to make an effort. But you don't want them to go to extremes where they get really stressed and really anxious and they go, I've got to get up at 5 a.m. because I'm a swimmer, which we crazily still do here in Australia. We've got to get you up at 4:50. And then, okay, so to get my 9 hours, I have to be, in bed around the 8 o'clocks. So I'm going to try and force myself to sleep. It doesn't work. And so I think we need to be careful in saying, yes, it's important, but we've got to we've got to think about how we're going to do this. And as much as you want to sleep, you can't force it. It's not like a lot of other things in life you can force and you can make it happen. You really can't with sleep. So yes, I often say to athletes, it might sound counterintuitive, but just wait till you go to bed. Wait till you're sleepy to go to bed, because then you won't hop into bed and toss and turn and get really frustrated that you're not sleeping.
And I think there's some growing research in this area, isn't it? That actually wearing a wearable device that monitors your sleep can provide you with this stimulus that is, oh no, my sleep's being measured. This bad sleep is now being measured. There's a quantification of crap sleep, and that being a negative cycle that people are getting into. How do you support people who say, don't have a problem getting to sleep, but ping, I wake up and then suddenly I'm really awake? What strategies do you sort of advise to get people perhaps in a rational place thinking about their sleep?
Yeah, and that's one of the trickiest things to do. Is we have lots of strategies for falling asleep, but less for staying asleep. I think you try to firstly address why they're waking up at night. Is it to go to the bathroom? And then try to address that. Often it's stress, and that's something that ideally you try to manage. It might be room temperature or noise or light, and they're all things that we can target with eye masks or earplugs or things like that. But then when they do wake up, I think it's always nice to say, look, if you wake up once in the night and it takes you a little bit longer to fall asleep, to get back to sleep, like, it's okay. It's, it might be half an hour out of 9 hours. It's not the end of the world. But if you're waking up more than that, we probably need to think of some strategies. And the other thing I always say is, look, sleep is very individual. Some people need more, some people need less. Let's just try to work out what works for you. And you just try not to get too anxious when you wake up. Know that you will fall back asleep again. Typically, unless you wake up at 5 a.m. and you could have slept until 7, you might be awake then. But if it's 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, you'll fall back. Don't fight it. If you've got some strategies that you like, try them, but just accept that it might take you a bit of time and it's okay.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think there's just a sort of a generic literacy about this area that somebody said to me, I'm always waking up in the middle of the night. I'm always these wakeful periods. And if you just show them a normal sleep profile, look, people will move in and out of sleep at different times. That's normal. Oh, that's normal. And then suddenly just accepting it's normal. And then people, when they come out of sleep, think it's a part of my sleep curve. And the way I've sort of positioned that is, how during the day you have a few periods where you feel a bit of a lull. That's like the opposite version of your sleep. And just lifting that bit of knowledge forward can really just help people get a grip of this performance of sleep.
Yeah, that's a great one. And another thing that this is what sort of I personally do on occasion is when I travel to the States. So when I, traveling east, it's not fun. The first night's usually pretty good because you're exhausted. Nights 2, 3, and 4 are usually I'm just awake, almost on the hour. And I used to get really frustrated by it. And for me, nothing works. I could take all kinds of drugs and sleeping drugs and doesn't do anything. So, but what I've recognised is that I just need to go to bed a little bit earlier, and I need to try as much as I can not schedule anything in the morning, because I'll get duration. I'm not going to get quality, but maybe I can find a duration of sleep it's broken, but add it all up, it's probably enough to make me be able to get through the day fine. And so for me, I just try to get longer sleep if I know it's going to be a bit broken. And that seems to be good for my brain in terms of being, look, it's okay. I'm probably overall going to get 6 hours and I can survive on that. And the other thing too is just to be like, you will get through it. It will be okay. You might have a terrible night, but usually what happens if you're not jet lagged is the next night you go into a really good night's sleep. And the body knows that it needs to recover. So this idea of let's not get too anxious about it and know that tomorrow night you probably have a really quality good, deep sleep.
That reminds me of the sort of pre-Olympic final sort of discussions to have with athletes, because when people have said, before the Olympic final, before the world final, I never sleep well. So to sort of put that attention on the days before that.
Mm-hmm.
So look, get good rest, bank it, get a sleep reservoir almost in place, accepting that if you have a bad night's sleep, that's normal. It's normal, but you've done something to offset that in advance.
Yes.
You're going to be able to perform, but you're also controlling or minimizing the negative effects of those nerves.
Yeah, no, that's it. Yeah, that's really great advice. And the idea that I often say, if you've been training for, I don't know, 15, 20 years, however long you've been training for an Olympic Games, your physiology is not going to change with one bad night's sleep.
Yeah.
Like you don't lose 20 years of training in one bad night before an Olympics. And I've obviously never stood at the final of any kind of Olympic event, but I'm sure that there's a certain amount of adrenaline and nerves that kicks in. And if you missed a couple of hours of sleep, you're probably not going to notice it. But yes, making sure you go into that with as an optimal amount of sleep as you can to offset any potential negatives.
Yeah. Hey, look, let's move on a bit. Let's skip our nutrition one on your hierarchy and go to water immersion, which you phrased as in getting in water. But obviously the implication is, right, what temperature is that going to be? How deep's it going to be? Do you need to go up to the neck? So I've had a love-hate relationship with this over the years about how this certainly was, probably around that sort of 2002 period, and some pioneers in terms of athletic performance leading this out. Where are you at with this one? Go on. Just give me a bit of a right. What's your sort of
where I sit?
I don't know where to start because I dislike the faddishness of it, of cold water immersion, because I'm competitive for athletes to improve.
Yes.
But I know it's useful for certain interventions. So come on. Update me.
Yeah, we could talk for hours on this, but I will say that I tend to separate, and if we're just talking cold here, so not even contrast or hot, because we don't know anything about long-term use of that. I think about the difference between obviously acute use and chronic use of water immersion. So, for example, I worked out in tennis at the Australian Open. Every year it's summer, it's ridiculously hot. They're playing every second day. If someone wants an ice bath in that competition tournament, I actually think it's a good strategy. I think it's something that they probably should be doing. It's 50 degrees on the court and they're playing for hours. So, yes, go for it. Then I might be working with some swimmers and they've got months of training for, maybe one or two important events in that year. And I think they don't have a lot of muscle damage. Yes, they're in the gym, but they don't have a huge amount of muscle damage. They don't have high core temperatures. There's no impact with the ground. They're not getting sore or anything, typically.
They're already in water.
That's right. They've got metabolic fatigue. They're not probably going to love the idea of hopping in an ice bath. If they said to me, let's find something else, I'm like, let's go for it. But to summarise, so I think what I'm trying to get at there is a swimmer is different to a tennis player in summer, is different to a Premier League soccer player playing 3 times a week. They're different vibes, and people want you to say ice baths are good or ice baths are bad. I think acutely in a competition setting, they can be, there's enough evidence to say they can be good, right? You do it properly and you've got a backup performance in 24, 48 hours and it's warm conditions or you're sore, go for it. Where I'm a little less comfortable is the longer term use, particularly after resistance training. With the good evidence from after endurance training long term that it seems to be okay.
Okay.
It's post resistance training where we see some potential negatives around muscle protein synthesis. I will say, though, that the work that's shown negative effects long term with ice baths are not in high level athletes. They're like university students training twice a week or similar. So the big gap which would really help us answer some of these questions is around long-term use of ice baths in good athletes. Because what we tend to do in research, we're really good at this, is we pick something. We go, I'm going to measure muscle protein synthesis. And it's really important. But what about all the other things that are around that? What about, does it help them sleep? Are they in a nice environment where they debrief with a whole lot of their friends and they have a bit of a nice time in a nice environment? There's other aspects to it that we don't look at. Now, every study that's done on ice bath that's mechanistic is great. It advances our knowledge, but we've still got this gap in the elite athlete long term, because obviously the argument is, oh, don't you want to be a little sore and a little tired, and a little fatigued? That drives adaptation. And then, as you know, on the other side, well, if you're a high level athlete training really hard, maybe if you feel a little bit better for whatever reason, you're going to train better and with more quality, or, add that up over a long period of time, and it might be good. So really where I sit is, if anyone says, should I or shouldn't I ice bath? I say, think about when you need to perform. If you've got a long time before you need to perform, you may be able to restrict it. If you're performing tomorrow and you've just done a hard activity, you might want to do it. But think about being conservative after resistance training, because that's where the evidence is. Even though it's not in elite athletes, I still think it's worth paying attention to it. But there's no black and white, and you've got to weave it into your own kind of training program.
So can I just pick up on a couple of points there then? One, around the response versus elite versus sedentary or recreational athletes. What's your hypothesis there in terms of whether the elite athlete could benefit, or whether we just don't have the resolution of response from an elite athlete? I'm just thinking about, the fact that metabolic markers or gene transcription markers that will be off the scale for somebody doing some novel exercises. You're getting big soreness, big responses. They're amplified, and so it looks like a big intervention. Whereas the elite athlete who's training a large amount, but he's getting a small training response from a big stimulus, they're going to need to try and get as return from that training as possible, rather than thinking about anything. Almost should be allergic to anything that's going to blunt that.
Yes, yeah, I know, and that's again, a really interesting way of looking at it. And I think, yes, you might have me going to the gym having a really, a really large response, and yes, definitely could probably benefit from ice baths in terms of being less sore, 100%. But then you've got the athletes where you've kind of got that accumulative fatigue, and maybe 2 or 3 sessions a day. So are they similar? I don't know, and people talk about placebo responses. I don't get into placebo responses with ice baths. It's like, you're in one or not. I do like the idea of belief effects. And if you're someone that believes that they work and that they help you, even if physiologically they're things we might not be able to measure per se, then potentially I think that they can be useful from that perspective. So, look, your question is great, and I think they could be beneficial for both, or they could actually be harmful for both. I think for the average person, like for me, I want to be less sore, so I'm more likely to go to the gym the next day. So it's more about motivation and making me feel good. Whereas you're right, as an elite athlete, you've got to be careful. You don't want to dampen any adaptation that might be coming their way, but you also want them to get through a ridiculous, for some, that they're doing per week. So I think other things to factor in might be environmental temperatures, injury history, other things that might influence their fatigue response. So yeah, great question. Still don't. I'd be hedging my bets on. I'll hedge my bets on that one.
Well, yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, you're right. I mean, there's these nuances and subtle differences in cases, they create work for us, don't they? We can unpack and unpick some of the specifics of a case of probably or probably not in certain circumstances. Something as simple as, well, a bit like the coming out of a sleep cycle. The fact that this ice bath, cold water immersion fad continues, or craze, I call it, maybe, rather than fad, because there is substance behind it, isn't there?
Yeah.
One simple thing is, what temperature are you using? Because I see a lot of people trying to get into a solid block of ice because it's more hardcore.
Yeah.
Whereas actually getting into 15 degrees, well, it's like the British Sea, to be honest, but it's that's probably going to be just as effective, but it's not going to be as unpleasant. There's that sense of sustaining the habit if it's useful, getting it right, that ultimately requires a bit of guidance in this area, doesn't it?
Yeah. And if you look at the research, yes, it's all around 15 degrees for somewhere between 5 and 15 minutes. It's not what the influencers are doing. It's different. As you say, it's a more subtle, it's still cold, but it's a more subtle exposure. And I think this idea of obviously extreme is better. I mean, there's a couple of acute studies looking at ice bath use where it's under 10 degrees Celsius and it increases a pain response. It obviously it tends to tense your muscles. It's not comfortable. It's particularly uncomfortable in that sort of environment. So this idea that it has to be more extreme to be better, I think is a big mistake.
I'm thinking of a recent article that was looking at Wim Hof, and my friend Mike Tipton from Portsmouth commenting rather pithily, I thought, was extreme cold water immersion is one of the most effective ways of causing a cardiac arrhythmia in otherwise healthy individuals. I thought it was just a beautifully articulated. Yeah, there's risk to that. You've got to be, rather if you're pinning your colours to belief effect, then you also think about a real effect. So I mean, okay. We're sort of going full circle a little bit, aren't we? I mean, I'm not fully up to date, but we're moving from cold to, the latest thing is hot. Or warm, which really feels like we are running around in circles as a scientific community, going back to, footballers in warm baths together. What's your sense in terms of this area? Is it shifting? Is there equivalence between the effects? Is this showing greater promise? What's your thinking?
Yeah, the heat is an interesting one. And again, probably I should put a caveat around some of these things, like in terms of geographical location, and environmental temperature. So we obviously have a pretty strong focus or have in the past on ice baths, and typically we're in a warmer climate, and so that tends to be something that we're comfortable doing because it's hot and cooling down just feels nice and it's going to bring our body temperature back down. Heating, on the other hand, is obviously common, probably more common, obviously, in Northern Europe, the sauna cultures and all those kinds of things. So that's never been something that we've really used that much. We have our own sauna outside half the time, right? So in Australia, it's often
there's
like
an offset. There's a contrast,
yeah, different. But getting back to your actual question, so yes, there's been an interest in heat, and a lot of that's, I think, come from sauna, infrared, those kinds of recovery strategies. I think what we're seeing is my philosophy is just because you do something in the recovery period of time post-exercise doesn't make it a recovery strategy, right? So I do think there's some benefits of being in heat acutely for short periods of time post-exercise. If you're not someone who's been out on a bike cycling for 8 hours in the heat,
or the US Open.
Exactly. They don't want to look at the heat. They don't want to see it. They're not interested in it. But so I think heat can be useful as a relaxation strategy. It's nice, it increases blood flow, relax the muscle, can be quite good post-exercise if haven't been in extreme conditions. But then I think the risk is it turns into a passive physiological stress if you stay in there too long, right? So I'm sure everyone's experienced, you jump in a sauna and it's sort of nice for a bit, and then it just gets uncomfortable. And you're sweating, which is the opposite of what you want to do in recovery. Your heart rate's probably quite high. It just gets uncomfortable. And that's where I think it doesn't become recovery. And we kind of need to be careful that there's probably this gap in here somewhere where you go, okay, I'm relaxed and it's nice. Now it's time to get out. Spa baths, which is probably the more common previously used heating method, same thing. Depending on the water temperature, you do sweat, you do lose fluid. You just don't notice it because you're in a water environment. So you can get quite hot if you stay in a hot bath for a long period of time. So it's just, again, gauging. To me, the advice is, because we don't know when to stop, just to go until you feel comfortable. And when it starts getting uncomfortable from a temperature perspective, then it's time to get out.
Okay, but in terms of the beneficial effects, whether it is improving functional performance or mechanistic response, is there equivalence there, or is there a similar response to ice baths?
Yeah, very little research in heat. Yeah, really in athletes, really like probably 5% of what there is in comparison to ice baths. So, but it is increasing. So there is going to be, I think we'll see more and more research out there. But I think there's some potential benefits. And for people that, I know, like, working in Australia, we have some of our Indigenous athletes, we have some of our great Polynesian athletes that, some of our rugby players, they do not want to go near an ice bath. Like, you'll put the fear of God in them if you tell them they've got to do an ice bath. But tell them they can do a sauna or a spa as a recovery method, all for it, love it. And so whether there's genetic components to what people respond well to or not, we don't even know that. So I think, again, this idea of choice and giving some people a recovery strategy that you actually hate, you absolutely dread, is not recovery to me, right? So, but yeah, we need to know more about heating, that's for sure.
I'm just thinking of my Geordie athletes and coaches walking into the North Sea and just saying, this is the hardcore way of preparing for the Olympics. It goes with the character.
I can imagine.
And then in terms of other areas, sort of generic sort of cover areas, I'm interested to get your thoughts on compression, anti-inflammatory drugs, and use of. Do you bracket them in a similar way to ice baths in terms of timing and intervention, periodized or use? Or have you got a specific, actually, you know what, this is a no, I don't think you should be using this for recovery purposes in these areas?
Yeah, so I think it is interesting that you say that, because it's kind of really only the ice baths that we really say you should sort of periodize or might be bad long term. Everything else, it's kind of not really considered, that might be an issue. We are in the middle of a long-term compression garment study to see if that does anything to adaptation. But at this point, we don't know long term. But acutely, most of the benefits that we see from compression are related to changes in blood flow, so redistribution of flow, decrease in soreness, which is potentially just from a reduction in potentially inflammation or edema. So there's probably a reasonable amount of evidence now to say compression garments are probably going to help, or they will do nothing, but they won't be harmful. And obviously now we've got the pneumatic compression devices, so like Normatex and those kinds of things. Less research on those, but I find a lot of athletes really like them. I think they feel extreme, right? So again, a little bit's good, so a lot's got to be much better. So very scant research in that area, but again, I would doubt would be detrimental, and they can be one of those strategies that is easy to do if you're travelling or on the road. It's easier than maybe finding an ice bath or something like that.
Okay.
So the only other one I'll touch on is as you said, anti-inflammatories, and it's a little bit out of my, I would say, area of expertise, but I know there is a lot of consideration now around long-term use of them, and that'll dampen adaptation. And I think now there's pretty much a generally accepted philosophy that unless you really, really need these for a medical purpose, then it's not something that we should be doing on a regular basis.
Yeah. Okay. And so can I take from that, in terms of use of compression, there's probably a massive overlap of the Venn diagram between water immersion and the pressure that comes from hydrostatic pressure that comes from that, and compression garments, which might perhaps be more convenient on the bus journey back from the Olympic Stadium, rather than getting in a bus on with a bath in it. There's an overlap, but a similar mechanistic effect.
Yeah, agree. And so obviously the additional thing that the water has is the temperature effects, but the compression obviously has that compressive or effect that you get from being in water. And a lot of these pneumatic compression devices now, that have cables, they run off a battery, so they're a really sort of portable way of getting some recovery. And look, in this instance, even if it just makes them feel good, makes them feel like they've done something, and it's a complete belief effect, then I'm all for it.
So if I zoom out a moment, the penny dropping, I'm not sure we can trick biology that well, moment was back in 2001, working with an athlete called Hayley Tullett, who she was, this interest in ice baths was very high, particularly from Paula Radcliffe, the marathon runner. And so Hayley was saying to me, look, I'm doing ice baths this year. I'm running more. I'm not as sore after the Tuesday interval session. So I can do a little bit more on the Wednesday. My mileage has gone from 70 miles to 77 miles. I'm feeling a bit fresher after those hard sessions, but I'm not faster.
Not faster.
And she then, I had this sort of goosebump. Oh, you wily old fox. She said, am I just doing more to get the same effect? At which point I'm then thinking, wow, that is perceptive. But also, if I think about what's in the best interest of the athlete, could my responsibility be to actually, could you do less and get more, or get less and the same? Because for a track and field athlete, the thing that limits training is impact. It's not like perhaps swimming or rowing, where it's a physiological overtraining type fatigue. It's more, I'm going to get injured and that's going to stop me.
It's stopping. Yeah.
And this is this led to a bit of work with Richard Ferguson, Connor Taylor, about trying to explore getting more bang for your buck. Type interventions, rather than trying to sort of take away the negative effect or this negative symptoms, should I say, from training. We were actually trying to amplify them. We were trying to sort of make it worse, but from a smaller training intervention. What's your thinking on this, about how we can try? We've used blood flow restriction, for example, in between intervals. What's your thinking on this as a frontier for getting gain or improvement in performance?
Yeah, look, I've had these conversations over the years, and I agree. There's definitely going to be people like that will absolutely. That's probably a good strategy for them. And there's going to be a really interesting scientific experiment that will reveal itself in Paris. We have a swimmer called Cameron McAvoy, sprinter. And he's doing, and you can Google it, it's all public knowledge in the news, but he's really dropping the amount of kilometres he's doing as a swimmer. Just unbelievable changes.
Oh yeah, I saw this.
In volume. And obviously then his requirement for recovery, regardless of what he chooses to do from a recovery point of view, I mean, he's very, very smart. He's genius level intelligence, right? So you can have these conversations with him. I have in the past about optimizing recovery, and for him it's like, well, it's not about optimizing recovery. For me, is not doing unnecessary volume, and so it'll be really interesting to see how he goes at Paris. But I will say, look, I do agree with what you said, and I think that there's, are we just allowing them to do more volume? And if that doesn't translate into better performance, then absolutely, I would say let's get them to be where they want to be and get them to their performance in the easiest way possible. And that's where I guess, having a good team around them and having people to be like, okay, well, we're monitoring this and we're measuring this and we're seeing this change in volume, but it's not translating to performance, then absolutely, to me, yep, let's take away recovery and let's drop the volume.
And I know this is an impossible question. I apologise in advance, but it's for me, what we've tried to do over time is we've sort of tried to reduce the nadir of a drop in physiological function. So
Yep.
whether it's maximum voluntary contraction or
Yep.
range of motion or soreness, that dips down post exercise, and then it will come back up again, and then it should increase physiological function, etc. And it's almost we're trying to sort of reduce the nadir, hoping that we're going to increase the zenith, when what I think we tend to do is you reduce the nadir, you reduce the zenith.
Yeah.
Whereas I think probably the whether it's possible or not to reduce the nadir and increase the zenith, I do wonder whether it might be possible to reduce the time scale upon which the nadir and zenith response goes. So it's sort of speeding that response, or whether ultimately, as we used to coin it, excuse the language, you need to sit in the shit. It needs to hurt.
Yes.
Don't spend all this time building up metabolic end products in the muscle and then try and get it out as quickly as possible. Let it resonate in the muscle.
Yeah. And I would say, again, a couple of thoughts come to mind, and that's, I think, where we talk about acute recovery and doing everything that you can in a short period of time, and that, where you want them to be as good as they can the next day for a competition or whatever. And that's where I think that, okay, if you can reduce the nadir a little bit, then that's possibly a good thing short term. And as you're mentioning, shortening the time frame there can be something that's useful. And then also, I think so that we've got the short term aspect. We've got very little information on what happens when we repeat these things, over and over and over again, which is where we've got this sort of disparity between this idea of, yes, what are we doing when we back this up every day, and were we doing anything to the time frame or not. So I think it's easy to say we need to study a little bit more or monitor a little bit more, but I think that's where the sort of, okay, acutely I'm kind of comfortable, but let's really think about what we're doing if we're adding this over and over again. And, I'll talk to people who have spent a lifetime in sport training athletes, and I'll have some that will say, so I've tried to encompass this in a bit of a figure, and I've presented it at conferences, and I've said, look, where I think we need to be a little bit careful, in competition, I'm comfortable. If you want to build big muscle, I'm not comfortable. Muscle hypertrophy with bodybuilder, I probably wouldn't do ice baths. Where I'm a little bit unsure is maybe you're a pre-season football player, and maybe you want to get big and you want to get strong and you want to drive some adaptation. And I say that's where I'm maybe you take it away from resistance training sessions, but yeah, you have it at other places. And then I'll have them say, but Shona, that's where they break. That's where, it's a contact sport. You want them doing everything you can, and then you'll have others that'll say, no, I think that's a time where you might be able to take away. So people have very, very different philosophies. And I guess the challenge is in Australia, we've done, there's been people who've decided to take recovery away, especially around football codes, and have just found that it did not work well. But athletes were getting fatigued, but they're training in summer, right? So I think there's all these caveats that come into play. And maybe if it was a pure endurance-based sport with not a lot of contact and muscle damage, then yeah, maybe I'd be really, reconsidering. I still reconsider. I still think about when I'm going to do ice baths, but I think that's a different proposition. Some of our classic Olympic athlete sports might be a little bit different to some of our rugbies and soccers and for us Australian rules football.
Yeah, okay. And that, like you say, there's probably the bookends of the spectrum there, isn't it? But
Yes.
there's some good certainty around this, of do and don't. But in the
Yeah.
middle, there's
Middle.
probably a maybe or every now and
Mm.
again based on circumstances. And then there's a big problem solving bit in the middle of we don't know, but this is our
Yeah.
best guess.
Y-
Which suppose the outlet there might be it could be dependent upon the individual, as we sort of referred to a number of times, that
Yeah.
this person might benefit from it, but this person might not,
Might not.
based on those sorts of observations that you're getting.
Yeah, and I think the other thing as well is I think people, when I talk about recovery, people I think that fatigue's bad. And I'm like, no, I think fatigue's really important. Like you just have to have it at the right times. I mean, you don't improve if all you're doing is recovering. You have to have the fatigue there. And sometimes you don't want, we talk about recovery bringing the athlete back, and you were talking before about about what we think of the super compensation, and then how that works. But sometimes you don't care if you're not back the next day or you're not back the next week. You're intensively training, you're going through a high training block, and you know fatigue's a good thing. And so I think it's that idea of the experienced practitioners understand when that fatigue is a normal response to what you're trying to do to an athlete from a training perspective, versus when that response might be a little bit abnormal, and absolutely completely fine if you're not doing any recovery and fatigue is what you're trying to do at a certain part of the training program. So, and I guess the other final thing to sort of say on that is that a lot of these strategies that we do only have a very, very small impact on that nadir that you were talking about. It's probably not going to stop the whole fatigue process. It's probably not going to bring the athlete completely back. It's probably little subtle things in there, but and I always feel like I need to sort of put a few caveats in there that I think ice baths can be good. I also think they can be bad. I think it depends on the sport and the training times, and we really need to and of course the individual athlete as well.
Yeah, I mean, what comes to mind there is the cool down, and I think we've got need a similar type of consideration, where on one side, a complete absence of cool down or compressing the legs, restricting blood flow might
Yes.
amplify. That might be one version. I used to work with one athlete on the track, and she would just collapse to the floor and kneel, and she would be almost in this sort of child's pose for yoga, and I'd be there going, "Oh no, you're going to be, the blood flow's not going to be happening." And then actually later, you might be thinking that might be a good strategy. Through to probably the swimmers would be a best example, where they're doing 50-minute cool downs with this obsession of getting under a lactate of 2, for example. Thinking that's a workout. I mean,
I know. And you're at the Olympic Games and you're doing the warm-ups and the swim downs that they do, and you've got multiple events. You're doing more well, we could talk about that for hours, but yeah, it doesn't make sense,
that
right?
sounded like it was a particular pet peeve of yours.
It's like swimming. Why do you get up at 5 o'clock in the morning? And why do we continue to do these cultural things that don't make any sense from a sports science perspective?
So fascinating to talk to you, and I've really loved the comparing notes aspect of this, but to tap into your latest thinking, but it's always punctuated by that sense of reality of how can we bring this to life for people. Have you got a sense of where this is going? Have you got an idea of some areas? I'm always resistant to sort of look for fads in the future, and a few things do stick about in this area.
Yes.
And I think it's mindful and responsible for us as practitioners to not go with the latest thing, because I think actually it can reduce your reputation or your effectiveness. But have you got a sense of where this area is going, and some key areas that you might be looking to that might create new ground?
Yeah, I guess there's a couple of areas, and I was having this conversation with a potential PhD student of ours, and I'm looking and I go, all my students at the moment are in sleep, and I look at the recovery work And I'm like, we haven't moved. I'm giving the same advice that I gave 10 years ago. Like, we've got a little bit more information about chronic use of recovery, but I kind of feel like I say the same stuff. And so I think that if, thinking pure recovery and thinking recovery strategies like water immersion, we could start that again with heat. We could start with contrast. We don't know much about that. So I'd actually like to get back into that space a little bit more. So we've wafted off on sleep for a while now. And so I think getting back to basics around some of the recovery strategies and understanding that adaptation response in athletes. In the sleep field, I think, we're moving really around this wearable space and understanding, who's it good for, who's it maybe not so good for, how can we learn from that? How can we get big data? That's the benefits of some of the wearables. And then the other space that we've got some people working in is mental fatigue. So assessing mental fatigue in athletes and then looking at how can we induce it, because that might be beneficial in some instances, and then how do we actually manage it, and what are some of the interventions that might reduce mental fatigue.
Interesting, a sort of a connection between the psychobiology effects of stress hormone responses to certain states and its impact upon something a bit more tangible or physical, like muscle recovery or cardiac recovery.
Yeah. And I think, I'm not the only one, but a lot of us physiologists have spent our life in the periphery and just waking up to the fact that we have a brain, right? And it's all connected. And, you induce a state of mental fatigue and it can have a physical effect. But we're also really interested in the connection between sleep and mental fatigue. I think they're really closely linked, but there might be times when they're not. And so I really want to try and understand that relationship, that if you sleep really well, can you still be mentally fatigued? And if you can still be, what's the reason? Like, what's going on there? I think it's an early but interesting area of sports science.
Right, fascinating. Hey, well, look, we'll have to chat again as this starts to emerge and it gets more complex and conditional and individualized.
Yeah, I've still got more. It's grey, Steve. It's very grey. I can't give you an answer.
Yeah, it depends. That's a great question,
maybe.
But it depends.
Yeah. How long can I tell you what, all the things I think about before I make a decision?
Yeah, like a massive sort of Excel spreadsheet of if this, if that, if the other.
Yeah.
But I think that's where the beauty of this really lies, isn't it? In that it's the recovery door's been opened and it's fully respecting that the input doesn't always necessarily result in the output, and we get a chance to affect both for the gain of the athlete. So fascinating to talk to you today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Steve.
I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. If you did, please take a chance to press like and subscribe to the channel, and for audio, please do leave a review. Thank you.